It's the year 7100 BCE. You are lying on a platform made of packed clay, and you cannot remember the last time you were alone. Above you, through a square hole cut into the roof, a thin blade of moonlight falls onto the floor of the room. That hole is also the door. There is no other way in. There is no other way out. To reach your house, you just climbed a ladder over the rooftops of your neighbors, stepping across a maze of connected roofs that stretches, unbroken in every direction, because there are no streets down here. There never were. Beneath you, under the very platform you're lying on, are the bones of over 60 people. Your grandmother is under there. So is a child who died before you were born. Their skulls were removed, plastered over, painted, and sometimes kept upstairs, sitting in the corner of the room, watching the family eat. You have never lived in a house that didn't also serve as a graveyard. You have never slept in a room where the dead didn't outnumber the living. This is Çatalhöyük. 9,000 years ago, in what is now central Turkey, up to 8,000 people lived like this, packed wall to wall, roof to roof, floor to floor, in a settlement so dense that archaeologists still argue about how anyone got a moment's peace. The answer, as far as we can tell, is that they didn't. And somehow, for over 1,000 years, that wasn't a crisis. It was just Tuesday. You've probably never thought about privacy as something that had to be invented. It feels like oxygen. Something you assume was always there, waiting for you, a basic feature of being human. But here's what researchers actually found when they started digging into how people actually lived for most of human history. Privacy, the version you think of as normal, is one of the youngest ideas our species has ever had. And the story of how we went from Çatalhöyük's floor to the locked door of your bedroom is stranger, and more recent, and more uncomfortable than almost anyone realizes. What you just assumed about privacy, that it's a basic human need, hardwired into us, something every generation before you also quietly protected, is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is the exact reason this story is going to mess with how you see your own life by the end of it. Let's go back inside that house for a second, because the details matter more than the headline. Çatalhöyük wasn't a village with houses next to each other. It was a single continuous mass of mud brick, built so tightly that walls were shared on every side, and the only open spaces were small courtyards used as trash pits and toilets. You didn't walk to your neighbor's front door because there were no front doors. You climbed up, over your own roof, across theirs, and down through their hole in the ceiling, often stepping directly over where they slept. Archaeologist Ian Hodder, who has led excavations at the site for over 2 decades, has described it as a settlement with no real concept of outside, the way we understand it. The roof was the street. The street was everyone's. And inside, the layout barely changed from house to house. A raised platform for sleeping, a hearth, storage bins, and the floor itself, which was periodically dug up, opened, and used to bury the dead, then replastered smooth, sometimes dozens of times over a house's lifespan. Some homes have revealed over 60 burials stacked beneath the living space. That means the floor you walked on, cooked on, slept on was also, quite literally, a layer cake of your ancestors. Nobody moved out when someone died. You just kept living on top of them. Here's the detail that should make your skin do something uncomfortable. Infants who died were sometimes buried directly beneath the spot where their mother slept, close enough that for the rest of her life, every single night, she would lie down within inches of her buried child. Grief in this world wasn't a private ritual you processed behind a closed door. It was architecture. It was permanent. It was underfoot. Now here's the part that really breaks the modern brain. You'd think, in a place like this, sex, birth, illness, death, and waking up screaming from a nightmare would all be things people at least tried to hide from each other. But the physical structure of these homes made concealment almost impossible. Walls were thin mud brick. Rooms were small, shared by extended, sometimes multi-generational families. There was no version of, "I need some space." Not because people didn't crave a moment alone, but because the entire built environment had never been designed to give it to them. The idea hadn't occurred to anyone, not because they weren't smart enough, because it wasn't a category of thought that existed yet. And this is where the story stops being about one weird ancient town and starts being about you. Think about the last time you scrolled through your phone in the 15 minutes before falling asleep. Think about how automatic it is to assume that room, that bed, that 30 minutes of scrolling is yours, private, invisible, unwitnessed. Now imagine explaining that assumption to someone from Çatalhöyük. They would have no framework for it. Not because they lacked feelings or intimacy or inner lives. We know from grave goods, from painted walls, from careful, loving burial practices that they absolutely did, but because the entire idea of a room that belongs only to you, sealed off from every other human being, simply didn't exist as an option on the menu of human life. You didn't choose privacy over community. There was no privacy to choose. And it wasn't just Çatalhöyük. That's what makes this so unsettling. It's not an outlier. It's closer to the rule. Walk forward a few thousand years and step into a Roman insula, the crowded apartment blocks that housed most of the population of Rome. Multiple families shared floors, shared walls thin enough to hear every argument, every birth, every death rattle next door, public latrines. And yes, this detail always gets people. Often sat side by side with no partitions at all, rows of stone seats where you'd sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers, having a conversation while relieving yourself, sometimes sharing a single sponge on a stick, rinsed in a shared trough of water, passed from person to person to person. Sit with that for a second. An entire empire, at the peak of its engineering sophistication, aqueducts, concrete domes, roads, that still exist today, never once thought to give people a private stall. Move forward again into medieval Europe and it barely improves. In a typical peasant household, an entire family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes livestock, shared one room. One. You were born in that room. You had sex in that room with your spouse while your children were almost certainly awake nearby, because there was nowhere else for them to be. You died in that room, often with the whole household present, because dying alone wasn't a mercy. It was considered almost frightening. A bad death, a lonely death. The entire emotional architecture of privacy that we build our lives around today. Solitude as comfort, aloneness as self-care, quiet as a luxury, would have struck most humans throughout most of history as something closer to abandonment. Even sleep wasn't private. In taverns and inns across medieval and early modern Europe, it was completely normal to share a bed. An actual bed, not a room, a bed with a total stranger. Multiple strangers, sometimes. You'd arrive at an inn after a day's travel, and the innkeeper would simply slot you in next to whoever else needed a spot. Nobody found this remarkable enough to complain about in surviving records, which tells you everything. It wasn't an indignity. It was Tuesday. So if privacy wasn't the default for almost the entire span of human civilization, the real question isn't why did ancient people put up with having none of it. The real question is the one nobody asks. Where did the idea even come from? Who invented privacy? And what happened to human beings in the process? That question is where this story gets genuinely strange, because the answer isn't a slow, gradual evolution. It's closer to a sudden architectural accident that quietly rewired the human psyche. What you're about to hear was buried under centuries of assumptions so deep that most people never even think to question them, because we've been taught to believe privacy is timeless, natural, something every generation before us also fought to protect. But here's what researchers actually found when they traced the physical, architectural history of the private room. The modern idea of privacy is barely a few hundred years old, and it didn't emerge from a philosophical breakthrough about human dignity. It emerged from a plumbing problem in hallway design. For most of European history, houses, even wealthy ones, were built as a series of rooms you walked through one after another to get anywhere. There was no corridor. If your bedroom was at the back of the house, every single person heading to any room past yours had to physically walk through your space. Servants moving between the kitchen and the dining hall walked through the parlor, through the sitting room, sometimes through the bedroom of the lord of the house himself. Historian Mark Gerard, in his research on English country houses, documented this in extraordinary detail. Privacy as a physical possibility simply did not exist in most homes because the architecture made it structurally impossible. You could be the richest man in England and still have 0 rooms that other people didn't walk through on their way to somewhere else. Then, starting in the late 1600s and accelerating through the 1700s, something changed. Architects began adding a strange new feature to house plans. A hallway. A single corridor running along one side of the building, connecting every room independently, so that for the first time in the history of Western architecture, you could enter your bedroom without having to pass through anyone else's. It sounds almost too small to matter. It rewired everything. Because once a room could be sealed off, reached without a witness, exited without an audience, a whole new category of human behavior became possible. Diary keeping exploded in popularity in exactly this period. So did solitary reading, private prayer, personal letters meant for one set of eyes only. Historians studying the history of private life. A massive multi-volume academic project led by scholars including Georges Duby and Philippe Aries, argue that the private self, the interior you, that exists separately from the version of you that other people see, isn't a fixed biological fact. It's something that had to be built. Literally. Out of hallways. Stop and let that sit for a second, because it's genuinely disorienting. The version of you that feels most real, your inner thoughts, your private doubts, the self you only show yourself, the diary entry version of you that exists behind closed eyes and locked doors, might not be some universal, eternal feature of being human. It might be a side effect of hallway architecture that's only a few hundred years old. Before corridors existed, the record suggests, people didn't spend nearly as much time cultivating a separate, secret inner self, because there was nowhere physical for that self to exist undisturbed. Selfhood, in a very real sense, needed a door that could close. That single architectural shift didn't just change houses. It changed law, religion, and identity itself. The Reformation, happening around the same rough era, pushed the idea that a person's relationship with God was personal, interior, something between the individual and the divine rather than something managed entirely through communal ritual. Suddenly the inner life mattered in a way it hadn't quite mattered before, and suddenly, for the first time, architecture was catching up to give that inner life somewhere to physically exist. Which brings us to something genuinely uncomfortable. If privacy is this recent, this fragile, this dependent on specific historical accidents of design and belief, what does it mean that we're now, in your lifetime, systematically taking it apart again? Here's the first modern gut punch. You almost certainly sleep next to your phone. That phone, sitting 6 inches from your face all night, is not a neutral object. It is a device engineered, quite literally, to know things about you that no human in history, not your spouse, not your mother, not the closest friend you've ever had, has ever known. It knows what time you stop scrolling. It knows what you searched for at 2 a.m. that you'd never say out loud. It knows your location down to a handful of meters, every hour, every day, silently, without asking permission each time. The villagers of Çatalhöyük shared a floor with their dead relatives and still had more genuine privacy in their nightly thoughts than you do right now, because nobody, not even the person sleeping next to them, was quietly logging their inner life to a server farm. Second gut punch, open plan offices. Companies spent the last 15 years ripping out cubicle walls, calling it collaboration, transparency, breaking down silos. But multiple workplace studies, including widely cited research out of Harvard, found that when companies removed physical walls, face-to-face interaction between employees didn't go up. It dropped, sometimes by more than 50%, while digital messaging shot up instead. Take away someone's physical privacy and the instinctive response isn't more connection. It's withdrawal into whatever private space is still available. In this case, a phone screen held slightly closer to the chest than necessary. We are, in other words, quietly recreating the walls we removed, just invisibly, digitally, defensively. Third gut punch, and this one's the one that should actually bother you, your DNA. Companies now hold genetic profiles for tens of millions of people. Information more intimate than anything a Çatalhöyük villager's nosiest neighbor could ever have guessed about them. Because it includes predispositions to diseases you don't have yet, family relationships you might not even know about, information about you that literally didn't exist as knowable data until the last 2 decades. Police departments have used consumer genetic databases to solve decades-old cold cases by tracing distant relatives who never even submitted their own DNA. They were identified through a cousin's ancestry test. Your body's most private information can now expose you through someone else's curiosity about their family tree. There has never, in the entire history of our species, been a version of privacy invasion this precise, this passive, or this impossible to opt out of after the fact. So let's pause and ask the question you've probably been avoiding this whole video. Was ancient humanity's lack of privacy actually worse than what we've built now? Or did we just trade one kind of exposure for another, visible, communal, understood exposure for the invisible, corporate, unconsenting kind? Because here's the detail almost nobody talks about, the one that should really unsettle you. In Çatalhöyük, everyone around you was exposed in exactly the same way you were. Total, mutual, reciprocal transparency. Your neighbor heard your grief through the wall. You heard theirs. Nobody had secrets, but nobody was hiding anything from you either. It was a flat, honest, brutal equality of exposure. What you're dealing with right now is nothing like that. Right now, you are exposed to systems that are themselves completely invisible to you. You don't know exactly what your phone logs. You don't know which companies bought your data last month, or what they inferred from it, or who they sold that inference to next. Ancient humans lost their privacy to each other. You're losing yours to entities you will never meet, never see, and can never hold accountable in the way a nosy Neolithic neighbor could at least be confronted face to face on a shared rooftop. Let's go back one more time to that image from the beginning, the roof, the ladder, the hole in the ceiling, the bones beneath the floor, because there's a layer to it we haven't touched yet, and it's the darkest part of this entire story. Archaeologists studying the skeletons at Çatalhöyük found something that quietly overturned the way we imagined this place. Isotope analysis of the bones. The chemical signatures locked into teeth and bone that reveal what a person ate, how far they traveled, how hard they worked, showed clear signs of physical stress. Crowded, unventilated interiors, cooking fires burning constantly with poor airflow, and evidence of respiratory disease and infections consistent with living in dense, close, unclean conditions for a lifetime. Living body to body, roof to roof, generation to generation, with zero separation from waste, smoke, or illness wasn't just a loss of privacy. It appears to have been, quite literally, killing them slowly, one lungful of smoke and one shared infection at a time. The intimacy wasn't romantic. It was, in the most physical sense, a health hazard baked directly into how the entire town was built. And here's the detail that genuinely reframes everything you thought you understood about the good old days of communal living. Those tight-knit, no-privacy societies weren't tight-knit because people valued community over individuality in some noble, intentional way. They were tight-knit because the alternative, living apart, living alone, living unwatched, usually meant not surviving. Privacy, throughout almost all of human history, wasn't just unavailable. It was dangerous. A person alone was a person without protection, without shared warmth, without anyone to notice if they didn't wake up. Solitude wasn't peaceful. It was often a death sentence. Which means the very thing you now pay extra rent for, a room of your own, a locked door, a space nobody else enters, would have looked, to almost every human who ever lived before the last few centuries, less like a luxury and more like exile. Now here's where it gets genuinely disturbing, the part that should follow you out of this video. If privacy used to signal danger, and now abundant privacy signals comfort and status, what does it mean that we're voluntarily giving huge amounts of our modern privacy away again, for free every single day, and calling it convenience? You didn't get forced into wearing a health tracker that monitors your heart rate while you sleep. You bought it. You didn't get compelled to install an app that tracks your location 24 hours a day. You agreed to the terms without reading them, because a maps feature was more convenient. In some strange, looping way, we've built an entire economy on getting people to willingly recreate Çatalhöyük's total transparency. Except this time, instead of a shared rooftop where at least the exposure was mutual and human, it's a one-way mirror, where you're watched and you can never watch back. And this is the reveal that should actually sit with you after the video ends. We didn't escape the world of Çatalhöyük's zero privacy floor because we became more evolved, more enlightened, more deserving of solitude. We escaped it because a handful of architects, a few centuries ago, accidentally invented the hallway, and human psychology reorganized itself around a door that could finally close. That's it. That's the whole foundation of the private self you think of as permanently, eternally yours. It's a construction detail. It's newer than the printing press. It is, in the grand timeline of Homo sapiens, roughly the width of a fingernail at the very end of a ruler stretching back 300,000 years. And right now, in your lifetime, without a single hallway being torn down, without anyone forcing you into a room with 60 of your ancestors buried beneath the floor, that fragile, recent, historically bizarre invention called privacy is being quietly, voluntarily, enthusiastically dismantled again. This time not by necessity, but by convenience, by a blue light in a dark bedroom, by a checkbox nobody reads. So the next time you lie in bed, phone inches from your face, door closed, room silent, genuinely believing you are alone, remember the floor beneath a house in central Turkey, 9,000 years old, packed with the bones of an entire family who never once, in their whole lives, had a room like this to close themselves into. They would have found your solitude almost unimaginable. And if they could see what's actually happening inside that glowing rectangle you're holding, the location logs, the search history, the data quietly leaving your room every night while you sleep, they might look at your locked door, your private room, your total physical solitude, and ask the one question you've probably never asked yourself. Are you actually alone in there? Or did you just trade a shared roof and 60 visible neighbors for an invisible one that never sleeps at all?